Imagine the weight of a long, tiring day lifting off your shoulders as you drive home, eager to unwind with your family. You're looking forward to a peaceful evening, a quiet dinner with your wife and kids, the simple joys that make life meaningful. But then, out of nowhere, the flashing lights of a police siren illuminate your rearview mirror. Your heart skips a beat. What is this about? You're not speeding. You haven't broken any laws. You haven't done a single thing wrong, so why now? Within seconds, you're staring into the eyes of a police officer, whose gaze is filled with judgment, his stance rigid and imposing. The air thickens. What's going to happen next? As the tension swells, you realize something. Something that will not only shock you, but send ripples through an entire community, changing a broken system that's allowed injustice to thrive for far too long. But before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It was a Friday evening in Tallahassee, Florida. The kind of evening where the sun sinks low, casting long stretching shadows over the quiet suburban streets. Darren Washington, a man who had navigated both the world of law enforcement and the struggles of his community, was on his way home. His silver SUV hummed down familiar roads, his hands gripping the wheel with a quiet relief. After a brutal week of high-stakes FBI cases that had drained him mentally and physically, he was ready to collapse into his family's arms. All he could think about was his wife, Maya, and their 2 young daughters. The thought of sitting down to dinner, catching up on the little things that made life special, that kept him going. Dressed casually in a navy blue t-shirt and jeans, Darren didn't look like an FBI agent. He didn't want to. He liked blending in, not standing out as the authoritative figure he was on duty. Just another guy, just another resident in his neighborhood. But tonight, something felt off. His instincts were on edge, sharper than usual, as if the air itself was charged with something unspoken. Then those flashing lights. The sirens shrieked through the night, cutting through the stillness of the road. Darren frowned, pulling over without hesitation. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. He had been through enough traffic stops in his life to know how to handle them, how to keep his cool. But something about this one felt wrong. The police cruiser rolled in behind him, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. The officer who stepped out was familiar to Darren, Officer Grant. He had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. His name had been whispered on the streets, tied to rumors of rough handling of black men, of power misused. Darren had never been stopped by him before, but now it was happening. Officer Grant's steps were slow and deliberate as he approached, his hand resting near his gun. This wasn't the usual routine. This man wasn't here for a simple traffic stop. Darren's stomach tightened. What is this about? He wondered. But he didn't voice it. Not yet. License and registration, Grant demanded, his voice as cold and abrupt as the night air. Darren, calm as ever, reached for his documents. Officer, can I ask why you pulled me over? His voice was steady, but his mind was already racing. Something was wrong. Grant's eyes flickered over the car, scanning it as though he were looking for something, anything, that could give him an excuse. But Darren wasn't about to let that slide. Just give me your license and registration. Step out of the vehicle, Grant barked, his tone demanding and sharp. Darren's grip tightened on the documents, but he kept his composure. I'm cooperating, but I don't see any reason for me to step out of my vehicle, he replied evenly. The officer's expression hardened, his voice cutting through the night. Out of the car now. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Darren's heart rate quickened, but he didn't let it show. With a slow, deliberate exhale, he opened the door and stepped out. His stance was firm, unyielding, but inside, he felt a growing knot of frustration. What is happening here? Officer Grant's eyes narrowed as he loomed closer, the contempt palpable. Hands on the hood, he ordered. Darren stood tall, his hands pressing against the cold metal of the SUV. This wasn't right, but he wasn't about to escalate things. Keep calm, keep cool. But as Grant circled him, sneering, his words turned ugly. I don't need to answer your questions. You think I don't know your type? Grant spat, his words venomous. Fancy car, nice neighborhood. But you're not fooling anyone. The sting of racism burned through Darren's chest, but he remained silent, knowing exactly what this was. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about power, about prejudice, something Darren had fought against all his life. As a child, as a student, and even now, as an FBI agent. He had faced this before, but this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. Grant's voice grew more accusatory. What do you have on you? Anything I should know about? A weapon, maybe? Darren's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained controlled. I'm not armed, officer. I'm not a threat. Grant's smirk only deepened. We'll see about that. Without warning, he stepped forward, roughly patting Darren down. The force of it was deliberate, meant to provoke, to intimidate. But Darren wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He stood still, his mind working, calculating. How do I get out of this? Then, without warning, Grant reached for his handcuffs. Turn around, he ordered. Everything inside Darren screamed no. Not like this. He had to take control before things went too far. Officer, I need to show you something, he said, his voice firm but calm. Grant hesitated, narrowing his eyes suspiciously. What now? Darren didn't wait for permission. He reached for his wallet, slowly and deliberately pulling out his FBI badge. He held it up, clear and unmistakable. I'm an off-duty FBI agent, he said, his voice steady, powerful. I'm not some criminal you can harass. The color drained from Grant's face. For the first time since the stop had begun, his confidence faltered. His eyes widened and Darren could see it, fear. Fear that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Just then, the police radio crackled to life. The chief's voice came through, sharp and commanding. Officer Grant, report immediately to the station. Darren's eyes flicked to the cruiser. This wasn't a coincidence. As an FBI agent, his car was equipped with a security tracker, standard procedure. The chief had been alerted the moment Grant had pulled him over. And now they were stepping in. Darren strode over to Grant's cruiser, calmly taking the radio. Chief, it's Darren Washington, he said, his voice clear and unwavering. I'll be filing an official complaint against Officer Grant. He racially profiled me and escalated the situation without cause. Grant didn't speak. He couldn't. His hand was frozen near his holster, his bravado shattered. The chief's voice was tense. Understood, Darren. Officer Grant will be disciplined. Darren handed the radio back to Grant, who was visibly shaken. No apology came. Darren knew it wouldn't. Without another word, he climbed back into his car, leaving Grant standing there, stunned and defeated. But Darren knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days that followed, Darren filed a formal complaint with both the FBI and the local police department. Dashcam footage, combined with audio recordings of Grant's remarks, painted a clear picture. The media caught wind of the story, and soon, it was making headlines across the state. Officer Grant's history of misconduct was finally being addressed. He was suspended, and an internal investigation was launched. His racial bias and improper actions could no longer be ignored. A week later, the unthinkable happened. Officer Grant was fired. The community, long silent about his actions, began to speak out. The police department pledged to confront racial bias and implement new policies to prevent this from happening again. This wasn't just a victory for Darren. It was a turning point. A shift. And it was only the beginning. Darren sat in his home office, his mind heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. His cup of coffee, now cold, sat untouched as he stared at the screen in front of him. What was just another mundane report was now something far more profound. This wasn't just about one police stop. No, this was about standing up against a system that had allowed injustice to thrive for far too long. Could it be that change was finally coming? He thought, though doubt lingered like a shadow at the edge of his mind. The firing of Officer Grant wasn't merely the result of a single mistake. It was a statement. A powerful one, sent with reverberating consequences. No one, no matter their position, is above the law. That act didn't just correct a wrong. It marked the beginning of a change Darren had fought for. Though he knew it was only a small step. A powerful moment, yes, but it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Friday night's encounter had left its mark on Darren. The confrontation with Officer Grant was something he couldn't just erase. Even in the comfort of his home, surrounded by his family, the memory gnawed at him. Maya, always perceptive, noticed his quiet brooding, but knew better than to press him. Darren wouldn't speak until he was ready. So they spent their weekend like any normal family. playing board games with their daughters, strolling through their neighborhood. But Darren couldn't escape the feeling that something was off, something that wouldn't let him rest. Monday morning arrived, and Darren sat at his desk, the cool morning light filtering through his office window. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a stone. He wasn't just typing a report, he was making a stand. This wasn't merely a recount of what had happened. It was a step in a larger fight against something that had infected the very system meant to protect and serve. Was it enough? Would anyone hear him? As his fingers hovered over the keyboard, his phone rang, breaking the stillness. It was Agent Michael Stevens. Michael's voice came through calm but firm. I just got off the phone with the police chief. They're launching their own investigation into Grant. Darren exhaled a long breath, a mixture of relief and frustration. That's good, he said, his voice weary. But you know as well as I do that these things don't always lead anywhere. Grant's been doing this for years, and nothing ever changes. I hear you, Michael's voice softened, a rare moment of empathy in his tone. But this time, we're backing you up. You're not alone in this. We're not letting this get swept under the rug. Darren appreciated the sentiment, but he knew better. He had been in this fight for too long to believe that change came easily. The system was built on years of silence, of looking the other way. Still, he thanked Michael and set the phone down, returning his focus to the task at hand. But his thoughts kept drifting, back to every other person who had suffered in silence, back to every other Black man who had been humiliated, harassed, and ignored. How many others had felt this? How many others had been too afraid to speak out? He couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about all of them. The story spread like wildfire through the community, and it didn't take long for people to start talking. Darren wasn't the only one who had felt Officer Grant's wrath. No, dozens of others, Black men, teenagers, even women, had their own stories. Stories that had been passed around in hushed tones, never truly heard by those who could do something about it. But now the voices were rising, louder and more determined than ever. One evening, while Darren was picking up groceries, he ran into Mrs. Evelyn Matthews, an older neighbor who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Her smile was warm, but there was something in her eyes, a sorrow that made Darren pause. I heard about what happened, she said softly, pushing her cart down the aisle. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Darren. Darren nodded, grateful for her concern. Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. But it's not just me. Grant's been doing this for years. Her expression hardened. I know. He pulled over my grandson 2 months ago. Treated him like a criminal. He's only 16, just a kid. Darren's blood ran cold. Hearing those words from someone he knew, someone who had been directly impacted, made everything feel so much more personal. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This has to stop. Mrs. Matthews nodded. It does. And we're behind you. The whole community is. As the investigation into Officer Grant's conduct continued, the media began to take notice. Local news stations, once indifferent, now framed the case as a turning point for the town. Tallahassee wasn't known for making national headlines, but the racial tension in the community was impossible to ignore. Darren found himself thrust into the spotlight, something he never wanted. He didn't want fame, he wanted justice. But now, whether he liked it or not, he was the face of a movement. Reporters began showing up at his door, asking for interviews. Darren was careful with his words. He didn't want the focus to shift onto him. This wasn't about him. It was about the issue at hand: systemic racism, racial profiling, and police misconduct. When he finally agreed to speak with the press, he made sure the conversation stayed on track. This isn't just about one traffic stop, he said, his words firm and unyielding. This is about a pattern of behavior that has gone on for far too long. We need to hold law enforcement accountable. We need to address the systemic racism that lets officers like Grant feel they can act with impunity. The interview aired later that evening, and Darren's words struck a chord with people across the city. For many, it was the first time someone had put into words the frustration, the hurt, the fear that had been festering for years. But not everyone was happy. No, there were those who felt threatened by the attention, those who didn't want to see their city's reputation tarnished. One evening, as Darren sat on his porch, sipping his coffee while watching his daughters play in the yard, his phone buzzed. A text. "Watch your back, Washington." His heart sank as he stared at the message. This was different. It wasn't just a criticism, it was a threat. And that made it personal. He showed the text to Maya, and they both agreed to report it to the FBI. The threat felt real, too real. The FBI launched an investigation, tracing the source, while Darren and Maya took extra precautions. Their home security system was updated, their vigilance heightened. But despite the rising tension, Darren wasn't backing down. This fight wasn't just for justice. It was for his family's safety too. Weeks passed, and the investigation drew closer to its conclusion. Darren was called to testify before the police review board, alongside others who had suffered at Grant's hands. As he sat in the courthouse, preparing to speak, his heart pounded. This was it, the moment where everything would come to light. And though he had prepared meticulously, part of him still wrestled with the weight of what was about to unfold. When Darren took the stand, he spoke with the quiet, steady confidence of a man who had endured far more than anyone should. He recounted the events with precision, his words laying bare the racial bias, the misconduct that had tainted Officer Grant's actions. The review board listened intently, and when Darren finished, he saw something in their eyes, a flicker of realization, perhaps even guilt. It was clear they could no longer ignore the truth. By the end of the day, the board had heard enough. A week later, they announced their decision. Officer Grant was fired, his misconduct made public for all to see. It was a victory, yes, but Darren knew this was only the beginning. Change had begun, but it was just a small step in a much larger journey. The news of Grant's firing sent shockwaves through the department. And while this victory was sweet, Darren knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much to do. But he also knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced. And he wouldn't stop until they were all heard. The department officers who had once turned a blind eye to Officer Grant's actions were now forced to face the ugly truth. The harsh reality was undeniable. They had been complicit in a system that thrived on silence. As pressure mounted from the public and local government, the police chief, under fire, promised to implement reforms. These reforms would target the eradication of racial profiling and hold officers accountable for misconduct. Yet for Darren, the victory felt bittersweet. Justice had been served, yes, but at what cost? The relentless threats, the media frenzy, the toll it had taken on his family. It was all a heavy burden he couldn't simply shake off. In the days following Officer Grant's firing, Tallahassee began to feel the weight of change. Darren's story splashed across the front page of the local newspaper, soon making waves in state and national news outlets. The headline was stark, almost surreal. FBI agent's complaint leads to officer's dismissal after racial profiling incident. For some, this marked a moment of hope, a small but significant victory in the fight for justice. Yet for others, it sparked fierce debates. The firing ignited a firestorm in local forums, social media, and even spilled onto the streets. Some within the police force defended Grant, claiming his actions had been justified, that he was simply doing his job. Others, especially from the Black community, saw it as a long overdue breakthrough. For them, it was a first step toward holding law enforcement accountable, a sign that change, though slow, was indeed possible. As the debate raged on, Darren became an unwitting symbol of that hope. His story, though personal, resonated with so many others. Letters began flooding his mailbox, emails poured in. Messages from people who had endured their own encounters with racial profiling, but had never found the courage or the platform to speak up. They thanked him for showing that silence was no longer an option. One evening, as Darren sat on the couch with Maya, they sifted through the letters. One in particular stopped Darren in his tracks. It was from a young man named Jalen, who had been pulled over by Officer Grant the previous year. "Mr. Washington," the letter began, "I've been following your story closely. I'm not an FBI agent, or anyone with power, but I wanted to thank you for standing up to Officer Grant last year. He pulled me over when I was driving home from work. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't breaking any laws, but he treated me like I was guilty of something. He made me feel small, scared. And I never reported it because I thought no one would believe me. But seeing you take a stand has given me hope. You showed me that we don't have to stay silent. Thank you." Darren felt a lump form in his throat as he read the words. Maya, leaning over his shoulder, read along, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You did that," she whispered, her voice thick with pride. "You showed people that they can fight back." Darren nodded slowly, the weight of it all sinking in. "I just hope this is the beginning of something bigger," he said softly. With Officer Grant's firing, the Tallahassee Police Department faced mounting pressure to address the deeper issues of racial profiling within its ranks. The police chief, once hesitant to take a firm stand, now found himself under intense scrutiny. Community leaders rallied, organizing town hall meetings to demand transparency and real accountability. Darren, though reluctant to seek the spotlight, was invited to speak at one of these forums. The town hall was held at the Leon County Civic Center, and by the time Darren arrived, the auditorium was packed. People from all walks of life filled the seats, eager to hear what the city was planning to do next. Darren sat quietly at the back, listening as speakers took the stage. There were parents recounting how their children had been unfairly targeted by police, teachers sharing stories of students harassed on their way to school, and organizers calling for stricter oversight. Each story weighed heavily on Darren, familiar and painful, but necessary to hear. Finally, it was his turn. As Darren made his way to the front, the room fell into a hushed silence. He wasn't used to public speaking, especially not about something so deeply personal, but he knew this was his moment. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady yet trembling with emotion. "I didn't come here tonight because I wanted to be in the spotlight. I didn't ask for this. But what happened to me? It isn't just about one bad officer or one traffic stop. It's about a system that has allowed people like Officer Grant to act without consequences for far too long." Darren paused, letting the words settle in the air. The faces before him were filled with determination and empathy, reflecting the pain and hope of a community at a crossroads. "When I was pulled over that night," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "I wasn't just another black man driving a nice car. I was an FBI agent, someone who knows the law, who knows the rights we're all supposed to have. And yet, none of that mattered to Officer Grant. To him, I was guilty the moment he saw me." The crowd hung on his every word. "But this isn't just about me," Darren said, his voice now ringing with a clarity that seemed to shake the very walls. "It's about all of us. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel less than, who's been judged based on the color of their skin, not the content of their character. It's about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience, an affirmation of solidarity. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Darren declared, his resolve hardening. "I'm asking for change. Real change. We need to hold our police officers to a higher standard. We need to demand accountability. And we need to make sure that no one is above the law." As Darren finished, the room erupted into applause. Stepping off the stage, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in a long time. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt like they were headed in the right direction. Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effects of Darren's stand continued to reverberate through Tallahassee. The police department rolled out new training programs focused on bias and de-escalation. An independent oversight committee was established to review complaints against officers. Community outreach programs blossomed, aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the people they served. Darren, though no longer in the media spotlight, continued to work behind the scenes, meeting with city officials and leaders to ensure these reforms were not just window dressing. He knew true change would take time, but he was determined to see it through. One evening, as Darren was leaving the FBI office after another long day, his phone rang. It was Michael, his supervisor. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing," Michael said. Darren smiled to himself. "I'm doing good, Michael. Thanks for asking. I've been hearing great things about the work you've been doing in the community," Michael added. "You've made a real difference." Darren let the words sink in, a quiet pride swelling within him. "It's been a long road," he admitted, "but I think we're finally getting somewhere." As Darren hung up, A wave of satisfaction washed over him. This fight, this movement, it wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about creating a better, safer, more just world for his daughters and the generations to come. Months passed, and the media frenzy around Darren's case faded. Tallahassee was no longer the epicenter of the national conversation about police reform. But for Darren, the work was far from over. One evening, as he was driving home from a late meeting, he passed a police cruiser parked on the side of the road. The officer inside caught his eye, and for a moment, Darren's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Officer Grant, he was long gone. But the sight of that uniform stirred something deep within him. Suddenly, the cruiser's lights flashed. Darren's pulse quickened, but this time, it wasn't fear or anxiety that flooded him. It was calm, a quiet confidence. He knew who he was now. He knew that, no matter what came next, he would stand his ground. The officer approached his car, and Darren rolled down the window, prepared for whatever the encounter might hold. But the officer's tone was different, respectful, even apologetic. "Evening, sir," the officer said. "Sorry to bother you. I just wanted to let you know your tail light is out." Darren nodded, thankful for the heads up. As the officer returned to his car, Darren sat there for a moment, reflecting on the incredible transformation. The fear, the tension that had once clouded these interactions, it was gone. As Darren drove home, he knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he could breathe a little easier. The world was changing, and he had played a part in it. Darren Washington's journey wasn't just about one man's quest for justice. It was about a community standing together to demand accountability, a broken system being challenged, and a generation learning to fight for what's right. Darren's daughters grew up hearing stories of their father's bravery. Stories that taught them the importance of standing up, even when the odds seemed impossible. They learned that justice might be hard to come by, but it was always worth the fight. And so Darren's legacy lived on, not just in the changes he helped bring to his community, but in the hearts of everyone inspired by his courage.